Okay, I think we're live now. So yeah, welcome everyone. Anyone who's tuned in and to anyone who is tuning in later to this panel discussion on anti-racism in biology and conservation. My name is Reuben Fakoya-Brooks. I'll be the chair for today, and I'll first introduce myself, and then the panelists will each say a bit about themselves, and then we'll begin the discussion, and we'll go through like a variety of topic areas. So a bit about myself. I am a founder of the BAME Ecological Network in collaboration with the British Ecological Society. I'm also a researcher for the NHS at the moment, looking at perinatal mental illness and the stigma surrounding perinatal mental illness. And my expertise is actually in ecology and evolution. And yeah, I studied at the University of Nottingham too. So who wants to speak next? So Celina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Celina Chien. My preferred pronouns are she, her. I'm a wildlife conservationist, a tropical ecologist, and a photojournalist. And I use my work mostly in the efforts to protect biodiversity. I'm Eurasian, so European Asian, that's how I identify. And I'm lucky enough to be from a really mixed background of different cultures and languages and ethnicities. But I'm currently based in London doing a master's in tropical forest ecology at Imperial College London.
Craig.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Dr. Craig Poku. My preferred pronouns are he and they, and I am currently a climate scientist based at the University of Leeds, where my first stream of work is to understand fog forecasting over northern India. However, my second stream of work is to look at the intersection of race and climate and how we can engage marginalized groups more in the conversation of climate sciences. I'm really excited to be here, mostly because I feel that there are practices that I definitely do as a climate scientist that are still entangled in this idea of colonialism, and actually I'm really excited to, I guess, share this discussion with the other panelists.
It's good to hear. Shay-Akil.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shay-Akil McLean. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the program for ecology, evolution, and conservation biology. Also, pronouns are he, they. Almost forgot about that. So my work is predominantly surrounding looking at some of the larger biological and genetic consequences, most importantly, evolutionary consequences of Euro-Western colonialism and racism, and looking at how it's shaped human genetic variation for the last approximate 600 years. So my work is surrounding that, but also looking at scientific critique of race, how it fails, how it works. And also a lot of my work is connected to looking at decolonial ethics and decolonial science practices.
It's incredibly interesting. Kai? Did I pronounce that right, Kai?
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kai Hoshijo. I'm from a place called Maunalua. It's located on the southeastern end of Oahu Island in Hawaii. I'm a current master's candidate at UH Manoa in the environmental management program. So I study land and water resources in Hawaii. I'm also a Hau'oli Maoloa Foundation Fellow. I'm focusing on traditional place-based knowledge in my community, informing resource management and giving voice to community members. I'm looking at how we characterize resource abundance in changing times, how we are to strive for what we call aina momona, or fat land, sustenance and abundance in our communities. And I mostly do my work through interviewing and restoration in my community. And my pronouns are she, her, and I'm just very excited to be here.
And I think the final person is it Milka?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everybody. My name is Milka Chepkorir, the pronunciation she, her, and I am an indigenous young lady from the Sengwer community in Kenya. We live in Embobut Forest and in Kabalet Forest, so we are forest indigenous community, historically hunter-gatherers. And I am a master's student in gender and development studies at the University of Nairobi, so that's where I am based currently. But yeah, with a specific focus on looking at gender and natural resource management, specifically on forest resources among indigenous communities. That's such a field that hasn't been explored that much in Kenya. And my work has been on the role of ourselves as indigenous communities in conservation and trying to fight the effects of climate change. And in this case, fighting against the colonial way of conservation, which is fortress conservation that was left by the British in the Kenyan system. And this is a system that doesn't recognize us being in our ancestral lands in the forests and living there and conserving it like we've done for ages, and now proposing the notion that for conservation to happen, then there's no one that should be in the forest. And this has led to a lot of human rights violations. There have been a lot of evictions, sometimes killings, sometimes rape, and yeah, just lots of human rights violation in the process of conservation in a way that is not respectful to the indigenous people's rights to their land and environment. Yeah, so for 5 years now, that's what I've been working on. And I deliberately went to school to do an undergraduate in anthropology because I was so curious of understanding why really other people were treating us the way they're treating us. Is it because we live in the forest and they think we are backward? And yeah, I've come to really hear very discriminative phrases about indigenous people, even when in school. You know, you tell somebody you're indigenous and they're like, no. Are you indigenous? And I wonder, how do indigenous people look like, or how should we really look like to be indigenous? So even being in the forest for ourselves has been such a challenge, and the discrimination just comes in every way anyway. And yeah, and that's what I've been working on, really, to make sure that that is respected and recognized, and it doesn't matter how much people have gone to school to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's me.
Okay, wow. So that's actually quite a good segue into our first discussion, our first topic, which is access to the outdoors. Did any of you really face any barriers, or did you have the support growing up when having access to nature? Would anyone like to answer that particularly? In terms of
whoever, I'll go next. I'll go last.
Shay? No, Shay. It's okay.
Oh, okay. My experience is, so I'm based in the U.S., but I grew up on the East Coast, specifically Buffalo, New York. Which, if I'm not mistaken, based on the last U.S. Census data, I think it's it's like fourth poorest in the U.S., sixth most racially segregated. So basically, what I grew up around in most cases was basically a dilapidated neighborhood. So in a lot of cases, the idea of even having, quote unquote, really nature to engage with was kind of odd. Like, the only way that I was able to really do that, because I'm in Buffalo, New York, as a kid, was like going to large parks and stuff. So like, we have that kind of stuff locally, but in most cases, the majority of that stuff is like in the burbs, right? In the suburbs. So like, I think there's like one or two main parks that we have in a predominantly Black neighborhood on the east side. It's like Martin Luther King Park, and I think Shoshone Park, where really what that is like an athletic field stadium. So access to nature in like in the sense of like when it is not in any way damaged or removed by quote unquote modern infrastructure. Like I didn't have access to that a lot as a kid. And the only times that I did have access to it was really when like it had to be like little field trips and stuff that our school took us on. Like, you know, like the fall stuff of like apple picking and strawberry picking and stuff like that. And I think like besides that, going to like one of my family members' farms that's in New York State when I was a kid a couple of times, but because they have a large swath of land and a big farm. But besides that, it wasn't much. Not until I got to undergrad and started doing archaeological work.
Okay.
Then I was spending way more time outside, like in nature. So like it's one of those things that is definitely racially segregated in the US. Like to have access to particular types of parks or different areas is rare, especially on the East Coast.
Would you say that was one of the biggest barriers that you face in terms of segregation, like the almost like the systemic effects of access to nature rather than individual barriers, between
well, ultimately it all it trickles down to barriers regarding mobility, so access via mobility, not to mention what resources are being put into maintaining particular kinds of parks, right? So of course the lower amounts of money going to inner city and predominantly racialized people's neighborhoods and areas. And besides that, it also has a relationship to some relative extent to the education system, because there's a problem when there aren't as many opportunities that are being created to actually facilitate making sure children have a relationship with nature and understand what is part of their local ecology. Like what kind of animals should they be seeing? What kind of plants should they be seeing? And so I think it's really like it has to do a lot with mobility and also education, like access to both of those.
Kai, you were gonna say something on this topic. What were your experiences?
I think growing up, I didn't have any direct barriers in terms of access to the outdoors. I was blessed to really be able to be in the ocean and the mountains as a child, whether it was hiking or going to the beach or surfing, playing in the tide pools. There's a really beautiful freedom of growing up here where there is access to nature in our backyards. That being said, though, that freedom is not the same for all communities throughout Hawaii. There are places more central in industrial areas, especially areas near military bases. Military owns roughly, or leases roughly, 206,000 acres of land here in Hawaii. I think that's 5%. It's a lot. And so these areas that are blocked off, it almost feels like the communities right outside are landlocked in a sense on an island. So for communities like this, it's not the same. They didn't have that same freedom that I had growing up, where I can walk down the street and go to the beach. And I do think in comparison to the generations before me, like my parents and grandparents, and listening to their stories, the access to nature has definitely decreased. And that's due to, increased development, but also increased private property, putting up fences, not allowing people access to nature. Whereas my parents have stories of just running out and playing in the gulches and the ditches. And so they had that freedom. And so that even makes me think about, how do we characterize like access to the outdoors? Because I might think, I had access, but my parents might look at me and think, you don't have access. You don't have the same access we did. And so that will change over time. And so if we don't know those stories of our generations that have come before, then characterizing access to the outdoors might not be well informed, I guess.
Okay, so you didn't necessarily have barriers in terms of accessing like nature and outdoors, but did you have barriers in terms of like accessing or continuing or considering, environmental sciences or just biology and conservation as a whole in higher education?
Sure. I think in terms of access to the outdoors, for those mediums, a lot of things come down to permits in Hawaii. If you have a permit to go work at this spot, if you have permission, so to say. Right down the street, there's 2 sites, 2 ancient fish ponds and springs that we've actually had to fight really hard for to even go and to take care of those places. And this is like millions of dollars, lengthy law processes. And so in terms of access to even go and take care of certain places and to have that relationship to place, very, very difficult in certain areas.
Okay. So, but in terms of your access or accessing higher education in biology and conservation, did you face any barriers, particularly not in terms of access to outdoors? I should have specified. Sorry.
Right. I was very fortunate enough to have mentors and people in my community that really lifted me up and would be able to direct me and network me to, talk to this kupuna or elder, as kupuna means elder in Hawaiian, or talk to this person and, they can get your feet wet. They can take you to certain place to get grounded and to really start working and connecting with people. But I do know that's not the same for the rest of the communities here in Hawaii. It's definitely not at all the same.
What about you, Celina? Did you, because I know you did or went to your education was in the UK like myself. Did you particularly face any barriers when trying to
actually, I didn't grow up here in the UK.
Okay.
I was born in Beijing, and I lived in Beijing in China for the first 10 years of my life. And this is a huge city with little to no parks in the center of the city. So I had really limited, I wouldn't say access, I think just limited opportunities to appreciate nature, to go out and enjoy nature. There's very little urban wildlife. I mean, most of the bird life, for example, because I specialize in birds, at least as a scientist, most of the bird life it was quite frankly eliminated during the Cultural Revolution, historically, decades ago, because they were thought to be pests. So millions of birds were killed and removed from the city, to the point where, I had only ever seen sparrows growing up. And so that whenever, the first time I moved to Europe and I saw a crow for the first time, I was like, this is the biggest bird I have ever seen. And it's the most exciting thing ever. And I still have it to this day. Like if I'm walking around London and I see a wood pigeon, English people are like, yeah, okay, it's a pigeon. And I'm like, oh, such a beautiful bird. Everything is, worthy of appreciation. But at the same time, I was lucky enough to travel as a child, and but in China, and I think this is a less a racial issue, but more just a cultural or how an entire culture of people can experience an enormous disconnect with nature, and how this relates to like the support and even interest to go into study biology or conservation. If people don't have a relationship with nature, if people don't have appreciation for nature, why on earth would they possibly care about protecting it, or even, being curious enough to look into it? And one of the things that I think would have a huge effect on this in China in particular is the fact that like we would have, not only do we have very little opportunity to appreciate nature because most of it in the big cities was removed, but you literally had days where it was illegal to go outside because of how bad the air pollution was. it was completely normal for me as a child to be like, oh, well, school's canceled today and we're not allowed outside and don't open the windows because the air quality is so hazardous that we can't go and appreciate the outdoors. Or even just like how rare it was to see a blue sky.
Were there fundamental differences then when you went to the UK and went to Imperial? As in, like, how was that? What was the difference? All the main differences of,
Oh, it was enormous.
Okay.
So I actually lived in Switzerland and Italy for a couple of years. It's very confusing. But these places, I mean, at least in Switzerland, there's so much. There's like the mountains and the lakes. It's so beautiful, and I was really overwhelmed by how beautiful it was. And I think really I couldn't start nurturing my love for nature until I had left China. Yeah, and even like considering the possibility of working in conservation. I always loved nature, always, watched David Attenborough documentaries, but at the same time, that was my only window into that world. So when I moved to Europe, it was like, wow, there's so much here. I mean, even just like an oak tree on a road, planted on a sidewalk here in London, I'm like, oh, it's such a beautiful tree. So I guess it allowed me to have this appreciation for small things that other people would normally overlook.
Okay. Milka, I saw you nodding quite a lot. So do you have anything to add to this topic in terms of like the barriers that you faced in higher education? Did you face any barriers?
Not really, but maybe before we get into the discussion about the higher education thing, just to say that growing up, I was born and raised in the forest, so we had unlimited access to the forest and the resources, even getting to learn the species of the trees in our own language and getting to know everything the way we are as an indigenous community. But with time and another section of our community that lives in Imbobut Forest now having faced evictions, of course, because of the notion that conservation has to happen without people in the area. So the challenge now with that kind of a generation, the generations behind me, is that they don't have humble time to stay home, to stay in the forest and learn about the species of the trees, learn about the traditional way of keeping the forests, learn about the taboos, the do's and the don'ts about this kind of a tree, about this insect, about this, all that just drives conservation. Because to us, conservation is not about going to school to learn about it. It is about how you've been born and raised to know that this tree is not cut. You don't cut a tree to kill it for firewood. You just have to pick the dry wood. You just pick a small piece of a tree when you need the herbs and not cutting the whole thing. That is conservation to us indigenous communities. And that is something that I appreciate, that I really grew up with. And I'm really humbled to have known that. And I'm looking at the situations now happening in my community. And I see a place where some generation will be talking about not having been allowed to access nature in the future, if we at all allow the current fortress conservation to continue, because then indigenous communities will no longer have the rights to protect or to conserve. I don't know how to really define what conservation is, because if we take it the school way, we are really discriminating against the real people who are doing the so-called conservation, who are indigenous communities. So then crossing over to whether or not I had barriers in terms of education. First, let's appreciate the fact that even the education itself is very discriminative. And it's taught in a way that does not appreciate our way of life as indigenous communities, and makes it, we have to learn the British way of education, and conservation is this, conservation is that, and biology is this and that, and make us look like what we are, and what we see is not biology, is not conservation, but it is something imaginary somewhere else. And in that way, then you find that most children do not find the interest to really appreciate who they are and the things that they interact with every day. And so, and of course, with the challenges of poverty and other things, and lack of schools, even in the first place, make a lot of children not to be able even to realize their goals in life, whether or not they want to take courses in biology and conservation. And I remember having like the group that I had to proceed to high school with from my village, what like half of them did not proceed. So you can imagine if that is the number of people proceeding to higher education, then how many will ever think of doing biology and conservation? So there are a lot of barriers to other people because they do not even get to that level of realizing what they want. But maybe I'm just the blessed few that realized what we wanted to do in life, you know. And for me now it was understanding why the government, why the conservation agencies, and why on earth people would think that we are not supposed to be on our land because of them being gazetted as protected areas for conservation reasons. How will an elder in my community and everybody else that have not gone to school understand what this top-down approach of conservation means, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's incredibly interesting. And Craig, so what would you recently had like an article published in the Times. Do you have any advice about your experiences or any barriers that you felt for Black students considering a PhD in the UK or any person of color?
Yeah, sure. So for background, I went to a comprehensive state school in South London, where I then went on to then do a degree in mathematics at King's College London. Started a master's, and not many people know this, but I actually dropped out of my master's for a number of reasons, and then worked in local government and then moved on to then do a PhD. And what I definitely found was that there were definitely barriers at each stage, whether that was from people who were supposed to be mentoring me or whether that was from what society kind of expects from you. I was fortunate enough to go to a primary school an elementary school whereby I had this idea that being Black is something you should be really proud of, and that was something that really stuck with me during my secondary schooling. But I was fortunate enough that I was seen as one of the good kids, and so hence teachers never really kind of like batted an eyelid. But I was also aware that a lot of my Black peers definitely were being told, oh, you're troublemakers, oh, bad things are going to happen to you, oh, you're going to end up in prison by the time you are this age. And so unfortunately, when you think about these really kind of like systematic biases that people who are making the decisions for you are then stating, it's then no surprise whenever you then have students who get to the age of 60 who get told, well, actually, I'm not good enough to do this. For me, really what then happened was the problem I then faced was when it came to looking at choices for universities, I was told that the choices of degrees that I was looking at, Black students don't do. I was told comments whereby the idea of me looking at doing stuff in the natural world was basically, I guess, unheard of. And it's actually really interesting the discussion that we just had about conservation, because I was really interested in conservation, but that's mostly because I picked activities that gave me the opportunities to go outside and actually, I guess, be in touch with nature, which I'm aware that that's a privilege that I had that not many other Black British students may have. And then when it then came to then doing my PhD, I mean, it was like the assumption that everybody would have a set of walking boots. I live in South London. Walking boots is something that you just don't think about. And so when I had to do my first fieldwork course, let's just say it was a struggle. And I think that because I didn't know many Black British environmental scientists to begin with, in fact, as it currently stands, there are a very small number of us here in the UK. I then felt that I was again really out of my depth. And then combination with some of the comments that I would receive from some of my colleagues, whether that was the reason as to why Africa is homophobic is because they have a lack of technology. The reason as to why Black people basically don't engage in nature is because they want to basically do this. These comments were things that I guess I kind of faced, and now I've gotten to a stage whereby I'm like, I can't stay silent, and I don't know if I'm now being more vocal about it because I'm now in a position where now that I have the doctorate, I can now use my voice to basically, I guess, be more proactive about these things. So I did face a number of barriers, and I'm at the stage where I've learned how to, I guess, address them and kind of, I guess, advise future candidates going through the system. But I want it to get to a point whereby it doesn't matter whether on whatever marginalized group you come from, I want it to be that you basically can go through the system and not have to worry about the systematic biases that are going to work against you. That's the stage that I would love to get it, but unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime.
So you said you faced quite explicit racism to some extent. Was this by fellow students or supervisors?
It's really interesting because in the UK, everybody claims that racism isn't a thing, and they say that it's usually a US thing. When in actual fact, I think that a lot of the practices that we do in the UK are systemic racism. It's just more that we don't like to talk about it. So fortunately, I've not had any direct racism from people who are like my supervisors from the PhD onwards. However, I've definitely felt a lot of barriers from school teachers prior to me starting my degrees, which I definitely realized that it essentially internalized me saying I'm not good enough for a number of opportunities. And I remember one of the comments that really stuck with me was when I applied to the University of Cambridge 10 years ago now. And one teacher said to me that with the grades that I had I applied to the university, not only would I get rejected, but I will also blacklist the school for any future applicants who basically apply to the University of Cambridge. And yet I still put my application in because I'm a stubborn person, and I basically wanted to make that point. And when I got the offer, and for a number of reasons I didn't make the grades, but when I got the initial offer, another teacher said, and this one really stuck with me, I never got into the University of Cambridge, I got an offer. There is a difference. Now, comments like that were things that definitely put me off considering going beyond and above my comfort zone. And especially when it came to me looking at applying to do a PhD, it required my university supervisor in my undergrad to sit me down 4 times to say to me that I think you have the capability to do that. So I've definitely found that during the university system that I had people who were more supportive of me, and I've met some brilliant mentors along the way. However, I do know that there were a lot of things that hit me at such an early stage that if I wasn't as resilient as I was, and I didn't have the resilience that my parents gave me, I would have not gotten as far as I have now.
Okay. Kai, so you were obviously, you're educated in an American system, so I'm guessing it's a bit different, or could be the same. Did you face any explicit, racism, sexism, classism, or homophobia? And did this actually affect your sense of self, or feeling of belonging in biology or conservation?
Yeah, so I had an interesting upbringing in that I was able to go to a Hawaiian school of learning where everybody in the school is part Native Hawaiian. But yet I took Spanish in high school, and I thought that that would get me into college because I didn't want to take Hawaiian language because no university would recognize that. And then my first year of school in environmental studies, I actually was at Seattle University, and I honestly loved it, but I wanted to get as far away from my home and my culture because I thought there's no opportunity there. It's a great grounding experience for my culture and my family, but in terms of conservation, in terms of future work and opportunities, no way.
Mm.
But then I quickly realized that my connection to Aina, my connection to land and resources was so strained. And so I came back home to study, and it was the best decision I ever made. But I did kind of grow up with that belief that no one would listen. And I think a lot of other researchers, especially before my time, have had to deal with this thought that Western science is this prevailing opinion over Indigenous ways of learning, Indigenous science. And I think this goes down all the way to language, the way we use our language, and how we refer to natural resources. Because in my language, we have this idea of kinship to resources, like it's our family, our little brother, our little sister. And I think the English language in general it's not really up to standards in capturing that meaning. And yeah, I've had experiences where you don't feel validated because I'm speaking about Indigenous science and Indigenous ways of learning in the university system. And I think in general, there is a lack of addressing that there are these systems in place that cause harm to students, Indigenous students, but also BIPOC students in general. And we have to start addressing them and being very upfront about them, because I myself have my own ignorance and I need to address that, you know? But yeah, all of these inequalities are very manifested in our university programs and in our research, in our very backyards in Hawaii's communities. And it's really all fueled or funded by our tuition and our taxes. And there are many projects within science that are very contentious towards Hawaiian communities and BIPOC communities. So
would you say going to a native school, did the curriculum did that cater for that demographic, or was it still quite whitewashed, or was it still quite Eurocentric, similar to what Milka I think touched upon?
Yeah, my schooling was, I feel like there were these emerging systems of Indigenous ways of learning, but the school I went to has undergone so much change over time. I talk to the graduates from now, and they're actually required to take Hawaiian language. They're required to go through protocol. They're required. When I was there, it was not like that. And this is not that long ago. It was maybe 5 to 7 years ago. And so there were these emerging systems, and that was really fueled by some of the instructors there and the alumni and the community groups within the school. However, yes, there were very colonized ways of learning in a Hawaiian place of learning. And it was a Christian school, and I distinctly remember chaplains and Christian teachers speaking at public events against same-sex marriage. And this greatly affected students. I think at the time in the legislature, same-sex marriage was up for vote. And this, I could see how it just had a really, really harsh effect on students because there's this heaviness towards it. This kaumaha is what we call it, heaviness. And that greatly affects the way you learn. It greatly affects the way you interact with your student body. And so it created walls, definitely.
Milka, because you obviously faced something quite similar. It was quite, you went to, well, your education was at the University of Nairobi, right? Or currently still is. Do you find the curriculum still quite Eurocentric, even though, or still quite colonial in the sense that it doesn't necessarily cater to the demographic in which is predominantly there, or the student demographic?
Yeah, Reuben, of course, it's still very, very, very Eurocentric. I would say it's sadly still the same, even in primary schools and high schools. And yeah, I would expect that by this era, the education system would have been recognizing, like, be able to recognize indigenous ways of life, especially in universities, but sadly it isn't yet there. I think it's because it's not the system, but the people driving the system that have been colonized. So unless the people unlearn what is wrong, then it is still continuing, even if we write in laws that this thing has to change. Because I suddenly remember just the other day in my master's classes late last year, when I was, trying to bring in the issues of gender and environmental protection or conservation, as you would call it. And of course, being from an indigenous community, and by then my community and another community called the Ogiek community in one of the forests in Kenya called Mau Forest were facing evictions. And I would just, I would share the experience in class, and this lecturer would tell me, just quote this, communities like yours are latecomers in the development process. And so this is why the government is trying to move them out so that they can live like other communities and we protect the forests. That was really offensive, super offensive. I had to tell him off. I had to really express my feeling. And there and then I just had to ask him where the world will go if this is what university lecturers are teaching postgraduate students. I could only imagine what is happening in high schools, what is happening in primary schools. Of course, when I was there, this kind of discussion wasn't in my mind. And now that it is here, I can just only imagine what is happening at those other levels of education. And of course, in very many ways, there are very mean comments made about communities that are traditional indigenous communities, especially that live in the forest, because being a Sengwer and other communities that live in the forest, we are very few, and not all the populations in Kenya know about ourselves. And so sometimes in high school and even in primary school, people are asked, from which ethnic group are you? And I would be like, I am Sengwer, and everybody would be like, huh, Sengwer, who are those? Where do you come from? They just make you feel like you don't belong to this world, or, and such just make people not want to call themselves who they are, because then they are made to feel bad. And it is still going on. It still happened even during my master's classes. And that's why I'm doing a specific project, my master's project on gender and conservation, whatever it is, but focusing on indigenous people, because this is something that I would really want the world to know, and everybody else who is doing conservation or forest resource management to know, so that at the end of the day, people can appreciate that there are people who are taking care of nature, and shouldn't be the way the British or whichever other conservation paradigm is telling the world to do. We don't have to militarize conservation. We don't have to take care of trees by using guns and killing people, but appreciate the people who are taking care of it, no matter the levels of education they have gone to. So that then brings us again to the discussion of education. Do we have to go to school to be recognized as conservators or as biologists? These things have been there even before schools came. So let's appreciate it, and unless we want to lose it all, because we are in this school of biology and conservation now, and someone else is in a school of architecture and construction and all that, and they will come work against what we are doing, So unless the world really speaks about conserving nature, all of us, and not others thinking about exploring oil and mining, which is going against what we are talking about here, then we will just crash the earth at some point.
That's very
yeah.
Celina, you've got your hand up.
Sorry, can I just add to that? Milka was talking a lot about, what does conservation even mean? And I completely agree with her. I am not an indigenous person. But I shared Kai's experience in the schooling system where I tried to like erase the part of me that made me different to everybody else. So I can't read or write Chinese, and I never learned how to I never learned Chinese when I was in school because I went to an international school. So everybody else was European. They were all foreigners, even though we were living in China. And so I thought, okay, well, speaking Chinese will only make me seem even more Chinese, and I don't want to do that. I'm going to reject that part of myself, which is just a horrible, it's not, I recognize that now as internalized racism. And it's the same, like as women, as, the global, not global, but, Western Hollywood standard of beauty is, a white woman. So there are so many other challenges of growing up as women of color or girls, trying to, figure out your appearance and consolidating with, oh, well, maybe I should just reject the parts of myself that make me different. And it all like comes down to like this all links into, personal identity and bringing that back into biology and conservation is how, as scientists, and as Milka said, we have this idea of what conservation is. And the word, even like in English, conserve, is to protect something that is like to keep something the same. So it's like protecting the state of the past. And this whole idea is founded on this colonialist, coming to these places elsewhere and seeing like, oh, well, we don't see anybody right here, right now. This is how it's always been. There are no people here. We're going to preserve it in this like pristine state, and we're not going to touch it. And that's conservation. Fortress conservation. I think that's what Milka said. When in reality, indigenous people have been existing as part of the ecosystem, and I think so much of how we see ourselves as human beings, and that's a fault of colonialism in biology, is seeing like, oh, there's human world and then there's nature, and they're completely separate. And there's humans and then there are animals, and they're completely separate. And we need to completely like obliterate this way of thinking, honestly, because there is a possibility of existing in nature, being a part of nature, having this equal relationship of both nurturing each other. The earth nurtures us, gives us everything, and we can also nurture earth in return. And the whole idea of conservation and protecting land that is completely separate from humans is just inherently flawed, because humans and indigenous people have been existing in nature for thousands of years in a healthy, respectful, grateful, reciprocal way. And like, just from my experience as a non-indigenous person, I went to university, I studied biology, and I never questioned the colonizer way of thinking, because that's what I always grew up with.
Would you say there's distinct differences between being other people of color? So, for instance, would you say being a minority person of color and a majority person of color? Do you think there's distinct differences in terms of your way of navigating in conservation and in biology? You are nodding, Kai.
I just want to quickly say, I don't know what like minority POC and majority POC means.
So I think it's, from my experience, so when running the BME network for British Ecological Society, I have to try and navigate ways in approaching. People have different experiences, even within being a person of color. My experiences as a Black boy navigating for a career within academia is going to be different to a person who is of ethnically Chinese or Southern Asian, descent. And it's about targeting or helping each sphere individually, knowing that you may be even more disadvantaged in comparison to someone else. Because I feel like naturally people just group everyone who's an ethnic minority into one big meld or bubble to some extent, and that's not necessarily the case, because there are slight nuances.
Absolutely. Can I just quickly I really want to finish what I was saying before. No, but then we'll build on this for sure. And I just wanted to say that, like, through my career in academia, even in like photojournalism, heavily colonial as well. I just want to say, like, after I graduated, I started reading books by Indigenous people, reading books about like Indigenous wisdom and how we can combine that into science, and how science is lacking because of its rejection of Indigenous culture, and how, like, science is so, but that's spiritual, or that's about feeling, and they completely reject it, when in fact, when it comes to protecting the planet, that's what we need. And I just, quite frankly, I feel so lied to. I feel like I've been lied to. And I feel like it invalidates how so many different people's experiences with how they can form relationships with nature, by strictly limiting them to, the scientific framework. And like Milka said, we really like hammer away at scientific truth, and we reject these other forms of ideas. But in the natural world, when it comes to human experience, when it comes to non-human experience of other species, there are multiple truths, and we're only looking at one of them. And the best thing that we can do right now to protect the planet and to uplift people and empower people is to open ourselves to these different truths and these different voices, different ways of thinking.
Very true. Craig, you've got your hand up.
I just want to kind of follow up on these 2 points, but I also don't want to like take up too much time, because I'm aware I'm all at the time as well. So not from the perspective of Indigenous people, but I also think as well that a lot of the science that we still do is very colonized, and especially from my perspective as a climate scientist, we definitely still see the way how we approach climate science as a very Eurocentric way of doing stuff. And as an example of that, I think that when we think about climate activism, especially with groups such as Extinction Rebellion, they claim that they're trying to talk for all voices, but yet when you see the protests, you see that they're predominantly white middle class, particularly males, who basically are on the forefront of these protests. And so the first thing that I then went through my mind when I saw it is that I went, is the way how we're delivering climate science information, or the way how we're trying to, I guess, approach climate science, is that the right way at the moment correct? And so I guess within the work that I've been doing, the thing that I've been doing myself is I've actually been going, why do we still have these kind of assumptions about climate science? And it's this whole idea that because we still see like the global north, or as I like to now think of it as the minority world, as the source of power, we then basically feel that that's the way how we should be delivering said information. When in actual fact, what we should be moving towards is the fact that every single person in this earth is benefiting, and every single person has an equal voice when it comes to trying to actually think about conservation, think about nature, think about our future climate. And the fact that we still do silence voices or eradicate voices, particularly from either minority voices or Indigenous people, I think actually we need to kind of stop and think, why are we doing that? So whilst again, I'm not talking about this from, like, say, a biology conservation perspective, I do definitely resonate with some of the comments that the other panelists have made. And I think that when we think about science, we are past the point as scientists to just think about science for the sake of science. we need to now start thinking about the human experience and human stories, and actually being able to take these stories on board. So as scientists, we actually can develop the way that we think. And this is something that I'm very passionate about, I guess.
Could you tell us a bit more about your research? Because as far as I'm aware, I don't know that much about it, but I know it's focused within India and folk related.
Yes, so my prior research project was to understand how we can improve fog forecasting over the UK by understanding the interactions of pollution and fog. So in a very simple manner, pollution has different compositions. Some of those compositions will allow for condensation of fog droplets to form. So you need pollutants to then have fog. And so my research was looking at that interaction. Now, I'm now looking at that same interaction, but over northern India. And what's really interesting is that Delhi, as an example, is seen as a place of really high pollution. However, what was very interesting throughout my entire research was that it was this idea that we get told, you're thinking about it as a scientist, just think about it as a scientist, nothing more, nothing less, think about it as a scientist. And even though we may, for example, talk about, say, kind of like impacts, the impacts are all associated with economical loss. We always use this one quote whenever we're doing fog science of, fog can cause as much damage as winter storms in like North America, which is why it's something, I'm like, that's great and everything. But I remember the very first case of fog, which was associated with bonfire night, and as an asthmatic, that was something that was really important to me because obviously I need to be able to breathe. And now when it came to the work that I'm doing in India, what's really interesting was that we had to talk about it from a visibility economical perspective. Whereas we were advised to avoid talking about it from like a health impact perspective. But one thing that was really interesting, speaking to some of the scientists out there, is that whenever people in the UK think about fog, they think about it as an inconvenience. Whereas some of the people who live in Delhi, when they think about fog, they think about poor air quality, and then there's an association with poor mental health, because they go, it's not that I can't see, it's the fact that I won't be able to breathe. And that's a very scary thing. And the fact that I don't know if the reason as to why I think about science the way that I do is because I'm a minority in a predominantly white space. And so because of that, I've got a different perspective about how I approach this work. And so now whenever I approach my own personal research, I now go, as a scientist, how can I take on board the stories of the people who live in the areas that I'm delivering the science to actually aid me as a scientist? And that's something that I know that I'm still in the very early stages of, I guess, exploring, because I do still feel like I have a very colonial way of still approaching science. But I'm aware, I have that self-awareness, and that's something that I'm still growing in, I guess.
So that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
A bit. So it's interesting how you're almost trying to decolonize your mentality to some extent. Yeah. Would you say then that there are like almost like key differences to like a scientist outside of the country, and then also in your case like the Indian scientists? And for instance, in terms of like driving policies, and are there like certain nuances, from the UK? Adopting this quite Eurocentric mentality and way of thinking, and then there's this Indian way of driving or change or policies. And are there any difficulties in navigating a space like that?
I have to be very careful with what I say, because I'm also in the position of trying to apply for further funding. But my diplomatic answer that I'm going to say is yes. Okay. And I say this because I think that as scientists, especially, and I'm including myself in this as well, but whenever you do science in a very westernized way, and whenever you do collaborations with organizations outside of the Western bubble, there's still a lot of attitude whereby it's not that we are equal, but it's more that we are there to save the problem. We are there as the white savior in order for us to be able to deliver our excellent science and basically help you in every way, shape, and form. And that was something that I was very vocal about very early on. In the University of Leeds, there are a number of collaborations within places in Africa, places in Asia, and I'm talking about these as continents. And the reason I make that clear is because we are very quick to send scientists over there to deliver research, but it was very uncommon for me to see the relationship happen the other way around. And whenever we do have that relationship happen the other way around, I was always finding that they weren't being seen as the experts, but they were still being seen as people who were trying to gain knowledge from us, when actually their stories and their way of dealing with science is just as valid as what we do in, say, the University of Leeds. And I can feel, and one thing I definitely felt, especially in this particular project that I'm doing, is that a lot of the policies or a lot of the ways of thinking in terms of air quality is still very driven by the West. We were in the late 1800s, we were going through the Industrial Revolution, whereby we, in terms of Britain, was doing everything they could to ensure that they were going to be the best leaders of today. But yet, whenever you've got somewhere like India, who is trying to do very similar tactics in terms of their own personal development, we've got a way of going, well, climate change is happening. You need to basically stop your development or stop your urbanization in order to ensure that you can't do that. And whilst, of course, you could argue they're doing it because they're thinking about the economy, in terms of climate change, by doing so, you're also essentially throwing very colonizing ways of doing it. It's them going, we are always going to be the ones in power. And so now what I'm trying to get people in my department who do kind of policy work to go is we need to acknowledge that everybody should be on the same footing in this world. So you need to change the way how you're trying to deliver the message and actually get their viewpoint in board. And by doing so, you'll actually then find that you have a much stronger collaboration. It should be a knowledge exchange. It shouldn't be we are the white savior, you are the servant.
Yeah, definitely. To steer the conversation a bit differently, Shay, so there appears to be like a biological effect on those who experience trauma due to racism. And could you tell us a bit more about this topic area? Because I know your research is centered around that.
Yeah, so at the core of what my research really is about is taking into consideration that the way humans treat each other has life or death consequences, which seems very simple and something we should all be able to agree with. But ultimately, it's a core point that Western science has really worked hard to try to ignore. Because ultimately, how you treat people and how you treat land and how you treat non-human animals and organisms is all tied together. All of these are closely tied relationships. Most importantly, ecological relationships. And one of the main things that I do with my dissertation project specifically is move from understanding collecting or analyzing information on race and within genetics research by using a series of different race proxies, right? So self-identified race and ethnicity, or there's studies that they use percentage of African ancestry, or they just use a general percentage of genetic ancestry as a proxy for race. So one of the things that I'm doing is in my sample, the race proxies that I have are mainly focused on interactions. So how does somebody end up having a quote unquote self-identified race or ethnicity in the first place? That's an external process. Nobody is born and knows what their race is because it's not how any of this works. It's an ascribed status. It comes after, same way gender works. So paying close attention to the fact that the only way that we could have the relationships that we currently have with one another, politically, economically, and socially, and ultimately environmentally, is if a particular power dynamic is set up, right? So one of the things that I try to get people to pay close attention to in my research project is what race and racism, like race is a child of racism, but not only is race the child of racism, racism in and of itself is a human ecological system in a series of different ways and levels. Most importantly, it's a human ecological system that shapes human genetic variation. People are here and then they're not, and that is very visceral. Like it takes a split second for somebody to end up being killed by a police officer. Not just in the US, around the world, because police suck everywhere. So it's the police. But one of the things that I'm basically trying to draw attention to is, well, what interactions are occurring that are kind of like, what interactions are occurring behind what we see as self-identified race and ethnicity, right? And then another measure that I use is, well, what is the respondent's understanding of what they think other people racialize them as when they first meet them? So this is telling you a little bit about the kind of social political environment that they're embedded in. And it's also telling you about a series of other conditions. It's telling you about socioeconomic status. It's telling you about access to different kinds of resources and institutions. It gives you a probability or a likelihood regarding where they live, probability or likelihood regarding whether or not they have health insurance, right? So I think that all of that is extremely important information. It's just that it's been improperly analyzed. It's being analyzed not only in a completely wrong way, but in the absence of the context of the historical information, which is crucial to helping us understand what's happening to people. So ultimately, like for instance, when I tried to explain, especially to sociologists, that this isn't a conversation about whether or not it's race or it's socioeconomic status. It's both. Capitalism is racial. The only capitalism that we have ever known on this planet has been racial. It's racist, most importantly, because if something's racial, it's racist. Only racism makes racial stuff. So ultimately, it's important for us to then start recognizing that this has to do with the material conditions that people have access to, right? And this has to do with the kinds of stressors that they deal with on an everyday basis. And what kind of control do they feel that they have over their own lives and the lives of their loved ones? So a lot of this is ultimately about drawing close attention to like the colonial relationships that we still have between one another. Because ultimately, of course, everybody in the West would like to argue and believe that we are so far behind, like we're so far past that. That was so long ago. Everyone's great now. Neoliberalism is great. We're all having fun. And nobody's racist. But we all know that's not true. So basically what I do with that project is look at the relationships between those measures of quote unquote race, what people are using as race proxies, the common percentage of African ancestry, and then the other two race proxies that I have that are grounded in measuring it and based on interactions. Okay. And I look at the relationship that those race proxies have to 5 different candidate polymorphisms for hypertension that we know are associated with controlling blood pressure. So looking at the relationships between those variables and looking to see what models are better at predicting diastolic blood pressure, average diastolic blood pressure, or average systolic blood pressure. And the way that I go about doing that is grounding the basic understanding of what, to some extent, what Nancy Krieger, and she's a public health scholar, she refers to as her eco-social theory of disease distribution. What I end up doing is trying to address some patches, some holes in that theory. And because ultimately, when we talk about the biological consequences of racism or the genetic consequences of racism, there's a series of assumptions that we're making. We're assuming that things are actually separate, that organisms are actually separate from their environment, which we all know is not true. An organism is, by definition, a part of this environment. It helps shape and co-constitute its environment, and its environment helps shape and co-constitute its own form of expression. So with that understanding, with that general understanding, how can we have a more materialist analysis regarding what is actually happening to people's bodies, right? Ultimately. And one of the things that I end up looking through is the general understandings of embodiment. And embodiment as a concept is very, very fluffy. And so that's one of the things I find annoying. But one of the things that I did with my research project is use a theory that is more grounded in understanding human interactions over time and at a series of different scales, utilizing that to help ground the concept of embodiment, like how is the environment being internalized, and then the organism also expressing itself as a consequence of that. What is that dynamic actually like? And also articulating that in more of an evolutionary context, because, for instance, one of the things Nancy Krieger argues about the significance and importance of understanding differential disease distribution is that we're not concerned in any way with necessarily allofrequency, right? That's not the issue. The issue is gene expression. That's why we're dealing with these issues regarding health inequities. And that argument in of itself is an avoidance of evolutionary genetics, because it's not true. We, like, anybody who knows evolutionary genetics understands that at the most basic level, it is definitely possible for a series of different congenital diseases, like in other later formed chronic illnesses and conditions, to have a direct relationship with allofrequency.
Definitely.
Just alone from bottlenecking,
Definitely.
population bottleneck or founder effect alone. Random genetic drift, it's a wrap. So there are evolutionary consequences. And so ultimately, so when we start, this gives us a different kind of context then to understand what's happened in the last 700 years, and then what's happening now, and the things that we can do moving forward. Because ultimately,
what would you say
it's affecting differential life and death distribution at a series of different levels.
Okay. That's incredibly interesting in depth. So it's almost like obviously racism has close ties to biology and conservation just in general, in terms of biologically. And obviously Kai, as you know, Hawaiian, natural land is inhabited and protected by, indigenous people, and often threatened by large corporations, wanting to clear natural sacred land for construction. For instance, the mega telescope on Mauna Kea. Could you tell us about, your experiences as like an indigenous person in Hawaii, and like the results from your research, particularly on indigenous land and resource management?
Yeah, sure. Great question. I think I'd like to start by saying that it is really difficult to be Hawaiian on Hawaiian land. There's so many historical timelines up to this day that show that inequality with how we manage our land and resources in Hawaii. And like I said before, we literally have a word for our perspectives on land, and it's called aloha aina. Aloha meaning love, and aina meaning land. So this term goes back centuries, and it truly embodies that kinship that Hawaiians have to our resources. We see it as family, and we love for and care for it as such because we know that it feeds us. And so when it comes to conservation in Hawaii, there lies a great inequality towards Hawaiian perspectives, land ownership, native and customary rights, especially for subsistence practices like hunting and fishing. And there's this idea of we are doing good by Hawaiian culture. And a good example of this would be condemning land for state-managed parks. Many places have been condemned in the past, and they've removed Hawaiians that have taken care and not just practiced their culture, but have lived there, farmed there, taken care of that place, buried their ancestors there. A good example of that would be like Kalalau Trail on Kauai Island. It's protected for its natural flora and fauna, but only a few generations ago, the Ka'aumoana family was still living and farming in that valley. And so when you take this human element, that Hawaiian element, and you remove it, it unfairly allows access to people who can afford to be there. But yet Hawaiians that have generations of connection to that place are put to the side. On Maui Island and on Oahu Island, millions of gallons of water are diverted from the eastern sides of the island, which are very rich in water, and they're diverted to the western drier areas. And this goes back from the plantation era. And this is an example where Hawaiians are kind of continually taken advantage of, and they're kind of treated as insignificant. You have a large corporation diverting water for large scale agricultural production or for residential development. But the water is being diverted from very low income Hawaiian kalo farmers or taro farmers, whose ecosystems and communities depend on that kalo that they grow. And on top of that, the legal processes that many have to go through, just to go walk an ancient fishing trail or to go hunting to feed their families is so hard. Permits are easily given to $1 million developments all over the state. But yeah, for Hawaiian families to be Hawaiian, it takes years, it takes lifetimes, and many elders have died without having that water returned to their patches. And I guess, yeah, from my research with interviewing, working with land and water resources from this Hawaiian perspective, there's a lot of heaviness or guilt, this intergenerational guilt and heaviness. And families live with this guilt of seeing these changing landscapes and of Hawaiians constantly removed for the benefit of business or foreign interests. And that's like a huge problem in science and resource management, this concept of we're doing good in conservation, but it's okay if we disregard native tongue of the land. So the 30-meter telescope,
go on. Sorry.
The 30-meter telescope proposed for Mauna Kea is another example of the Hawaiian community saying peacefully no. And Kia'i, or protectors, were holding space on Mauna Kea for months, and they blocked the road there. And they actually set up what was called Pu'uhuluhulu University. And so they had lecturers come, they had practitioners come, and every single day they cooked for each other, they held space, and they actually taught classes. But they were met with police, and 38 elders were arrested during the protests. And I mean, some were in wheelchairs. And we were met with PR campaigns to twist narratives, to say that it will provide jobs for the local community and will give scholarships to Hawaiians in STEM research. But to us, that won't feed our families. And that only makes us more reliant on that Western culture, which has not been reliable. So there's this large issue of we're doing good by Hawaiians, but is it really Hawaiian? And how can you tell a native culture that has sailed across the ocean by the stars without any Western technology? They just finished a worldwide voyage in 2015. How can you tell a culture like that we need to see the stars with a telescope? And the reality is we can see and they cannot see. But it's also an important responsibility to not create that wall and also understand that, okay, we need to help everybody see, we need to help and share and not close ourselves off.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You often have you faced some similar, challenges too, working with indigenous person advocacy or advocacy?
Yeah.
Oh, so now this question was directed to Milka. Sorry.
Yes, Reuben. Yeah, just listening to Kai feels like listening to myself, but now in a different way, and listening to someone from my community, because the experience is just the same. The removal of people from the forest in the name of conservation has been so real here, but we have been able to resist that for some time. And of course, the consequences and the impacts on the way are very dire. Sometimes people have had, people have been killed. We've lost very many elders who have gotten sick because of being exposed to cold. Of course, when I mean eviction here, I mean people just their houses being brought down and burnt, and everything is destroyed by fire. So people are left in the forest in the cold. We have just had a lot of loss culturally and property wise and all that. And of course, we have done a lot of advocacy at the national level just to make sure that the community land rights are recognized. So we have elders who have been fighting for this cause and actually succeeded to have an article in the Constitution to recognize community land rights. And of course, an act of parliament followed later, and another act of parliament specifically on forests followed up later. But that one now did not actualize what the Constitution says, because according to the government of Kenya, still the Fortress Way conservation is what runs the day. So according to them, communities cannot claim land that is in forest reserves, and despite us being there for all these years, that is not still something that they can practically come to reality to. And that is why evictions is continuing. And so interestingly, the evictions continue often when there is funding from abroad.
Would you say? Sorry, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, and some organizations, some conservation organizations have had to pull out for a number of times because of the evictions and the human rights violation associated with the conservation paradigm in Kenya. And recently it was the EU actually cancelling a conservation project because of the human rights violation still against my community and another community, the Ogiek community. And yeah, to me, I'm just trying to process this and looking at the paradox at which the government of Kenya and maybe the whole population in Kenya that is not forest indigenous communities is at, because we are fighting against a system that was brought by a colonial government, the system that denies people to be in forests for conservation reasons. And now the funding that wants to support conservation again through the government still coming from the same places, the same colonial places. So even when we are speaking against the funding or even against the conservation paradigm itself, the government would often say, no, you're opposing funds that should be coming to support the government. You're following ideas of white people, so they don't even appreciate the fact that it is us who have been in the forest for the longer, and that is what we want to still preserve. So their interest is just getting the funds, which we don't know exactly how they are going to do it, to practically do the conservation using those funds. And yeah, that's what I would say for now. Yeah, Reuben?
Would you say there's what would you say are the different challenges then, like working at the international level, because you've worked at the international level, and then like opposed to like the national scale things?
The challenge with working at the international level is that you will talk and people would really want to look like they are listening to you, and they would look like they're really caring, and they're, oh, we are sorry because this is happening. But in reality, that is not it. Because as I said, the funds that still go on to support the conservation paradigm is still from the same places. And yeah, I will just give one example. One time I was in Oxford University for a summer course on conservation, just was in 2018. And we met a professor that lectures at the School of Environment and Earth Science. And, you know, the very same idea of conservation is equals to not no people in forests or no people in conservation areas is what he teaches. And that really got me thinking, okay, now I am in the heart of where this kind of knowledge comes from. You know, now I understand why the Kenyan government cannot appreciate the efforts and the practices by indigenous people to conserve. And yeah, so the challenges vary. So that is the kind of challenge that comes when you're in an international platform. It is, you're being lied to on the face, you know, with a very smiley face. That is what happens in the international level. But at home, it is both brutality and lies just on your face, and human rights violations just on your face. So either way, it's just still challenging. It's even more challenging at the national level because no one really wants to believe that you are speaking something that makes sense, especially because you are an indigenous person and maybe you have not gone to school enough to be a doctor who and who or a professor who and who. And they will ask you, as I said before, they would look at you and be like, are you indigenous? You know, and that just, it demoralizes. It makes you really realize that really no one is out there to want to listen to you. Or sometimes, of course, the more diplomatic ones will look like the international ones, you know, give you a smiley face, but in real sense, there will be nothing that they'll be doing. Yeah.
But yeah, that was, wow. I'm just aware of the time now, so it's only got a few more minutes before we finish. But I would like to just, you know, conclude, you know, the panel discussion in terms of, from what I've heard, there's almost the similar themes, because everyone's obviously faced very individual and specific themes, specific, you know, situations with regards to racism, and just their, you know, how it's approached within their country and how their experiences are just very distinct. But I think there's something that was almost quite universal, was that there was this Eurocentric, quite colonist approach in teaching and approaching conservation and biology. And does anyone have any solutions, you know, going forward? One, you know, with regards to that being as like a barrier, and two, you know, how is that affecting, you know, our, you know, journey through academia and conservation and biology, and maybe someone else, you know, a person of color. Correct. Well, Craig and Celina, you've got both your hands up, so I would say Craig first, and then Celina. Quickly, because we've only got a few minutes, but yeah.
Thank you. I think the reality is that as a person of color, we're never, unfortunately, going to be, I don't think that in my lifetime there will be a proper representation of people of color within climate sciences as long as I'm in academia at this moment in time. And so the thing that I would definitely say is that to my white colleagues who may be listening to this is that you need to be able to at least educate yourself. I think that as a person of color, I've definitely found that I'm really looking at educating myself in terms of some of the colonial ways of how I approach science. And in addition to that as well, how my ways of dealing with science may be, for example, exclusionary to, say, indigenous people. And whilst obviously I'm talking about this from a climate science perspective, I could definitely say that this could be related both to biology and conservation. So I think that's the first step that needs to be done. And then the second thing that needs to be done is once we are able to at least acknowledge that a lot of the science that we do deliver is still within a very colonial way of basically working, it's working out what can we do to actually try and practically decolonize that. Does that mean that we basically need to get experts who, for example, are from underrepresented groups? It's the fact that we need to be able to stop particular practices that are basically being put forward whenever we're delivering science curriculums. Can it be as simple as saying that actually we need to acknowledge that English is the language that we use in all of our curriculums, but actually there are other languages that still have just as much weight, if not more? I think that the first thing we can all do is education. And I know that there are some of my colleagues who have already started that, but I think this needs to keep going. And I think we need to basically see it as decolonization to some people is a buzzword. Actually, decolonization, I think, is the first step to actually realize that we need to be able to do this for us to actually be able to be united as scientists.
Okay. Celina?
Well, that was beautifully said. I don't know how I'm going to follow up. But to add on to that idea of educating oneself and decolonizing our systems, I think it's also important that we as scientists, as communicators, as human beings, as people, we reevaluate and re-examine the way we approach these issues, the way we see ourselves in the world, the way we engage with the natural world. And, personally, in terms of my research and what I do as a scientist, but also as a photojournalist, communicating environmental issues to the public, is using science to show people that decolonization is the way forward. It is the better way. To speak their language and show we have the evidence that says this is the way forward. And so, for example, one of the things I look at is land sharing over land sparing, which is similar to what Milka was talking about, how instead of fortress conservation, let's realize the conservation value of land that is inhabited by indigenous people. Let's remember the fact that only of the whole global population, only 5% of all people are indigenous, and yet they protect 80% of biodiversity. And it's just using our platforms, our skills, and our voices to really hammer this decolonization message home. And decolonization will then lead to protecting biodiversity. It will lead to the empowerment of women. It will lead to racial justice and social justice. And it's all connected, which is really the meaning of intersectional environmentalism.
No, definitely. I was beautifully said by both Craig and Celina. I couldn't say anything. I don't think I've got anything to add to that. But yeah, I think that rounds up the discussion. I think to end, I have to thank the Woodland Trust for sponsoring this panel discussion. I've got almost a short statement and a slide to show quickly, so I'm going to share my screen. If I can figure this out on Google Meets. I think, okay. So is my screen being shared now? Is it being shared? Oh, I'm not too sure if it's being shared.
It's not being shared.
It's not being shared, okay.
No. It's in the bottom right corner. It says present now.
Wait, let's see. Is it showing now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Load.
Okay. So yeah, the Woodland Trust is committed to ensuring equality, diversity, and inclusivity in the groundbreaking woodland conservation research that they fund. We aim to increase the diversity of scientists in our scientific community by reducing barriers in our research funding application process. Opening our first public call for grants in 2021 is the first step in that commitment. Our research program focuses on 5 major themes: tree and woodland health, tree and woodland management, trees on farmland, economics and ecosystem services, and land use change. If you need research funding in one of these areas, please do apply for the 2021 Woodland Trust Research Grant Call. And you can contact them and find out more on a researchonwoodlandtrust.org.uk. So thank you, the Woodland Trust, for, let me stop sharing now, for sponsoring this panel discussion. I thought personally it was very eye-opening. I've engaged and listened to and learned a lot from everyone's, just from the expertise and their experiences from one side of the world to the next. So yeah, I think that ends this panel discussion, the Biodiverse Festival. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody else.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.